You know, if we're going to worship at the altar of the Constitution, I get to worship too. And I've got two constitutional amendments on my side. He's got one. I've got the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment, one of which requires equal protection, which incidentally those districts.
I distributed pocket constitutions at my wedding. Here's a special commemorative. Here's our names and the date on it. You know, so.
That district you saw on the board violated the 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. So to each one.
So you want to dilute the power of racial minorities to elect their candidate of choice.
And notice the word dilute that he used. If one were to dilute the power of minorities to elect their candidate of choice, that would also violate the law. So there's a sweet spot between those two positions, between dilution, where you stop minorities from ever winning election, and from those things you've seen on the screen. There's an area in between those two spots that is legal, proper, and allowed.
But regardless of whether they're minorities or not, if they're incumbents, they're going to win because of the campaign finance system.
But this gets back to a couple other issues. I mean, part of the big strategy of
We'll let you decide what each one of us is being facetious about.
By the way, this is a rare bird. If you guys want to actually see us be like one of three people who actually agree in a room full of people who disagree with us, come tomorrow and you'll see that this is a mildly artificial disagreement.
Sorry.
This gerrymandering ends up being one of the big plays of big politics. Political parties will play 10, 20 year games to try and get little state house reps involved so they can redo districts. And that's where I'm seeing the big problem is if you remove the gerrymandering aspect, you can remove the long game from politics and start doing a actual closer to census vote.
Yeah, well, you hit the nail on the head when you said 10-year game, because that's exactly what it is. It's a 10-year game. And it is not a just...
You forced me to sit here so I would sweat like that.
It's not a justiciable issue to claim that political gerrymandering occurred. It's the rules of the game. Look, I haven't given this talk for a while, why this is good. It is okay for Democrats to give the shaft to Republicans and vice versa in the redistricting process. And it might sound bad, but I like the alternative, like jousting, murder. Look at all the things throughout history.
But my Constitution doesn't mention parties, let alone Republicans.
Well, that's exactly why it's not a justiciable issue.
But why don't we just draw the districts like a grid?
Because your Constitution doesn't ban us from drawing them in a partisan fashion.
But it doesn't have to be constitutional to be bad.
True, but I worry more about the Constitution than people's particular preferences.
I have a question. So I actually thought about gerrymandering specifically from, the partisan, incumbents getting in and so forth. That's primarily what I thought of it as. And then the fact that it becomes like a regional diversity in districts. I mean, you saw the one, Illinois.
Are these current districts?
What?
Are these current districts?
Those aren't.
No, they're recent, but not since they just
from the
changed.
90s.
But
They're before the I-85 case, I think. So.
I can't remember the date. Well, anyways, so I think of it as like a regional problem that people aren't being represented. Like, what does somebody in Rockford necessarily have to do with someone who lives in a suburban or rural area of Peoria, because it encompasses all that. So I think of that part, plus the incumbent issue, plus the racially divided, really polarized districts. So what do you think is I think the racial polarization is probably the biggest problem now, having heard you say that, but.
Look, if you don't like partisan gerrymandering, move to Iowa. Iowa has an independent commission that has a bunch of very bland milk toast criteria. Because if you ever look at a county map in Iowa, you'll see it looks like a chessboard. Move to Arizona, which has a purported nonpartisan redistricting commission.
But see, these are problematic in other ways. In all seriousness, I think the alternative to political gerrymandering is to interpret Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act in the correct way and then to actually district based on geographic lines and population. Racial composition be damned.
Well, we want to have that debate?
Yes. Don't you agree with that?
Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act was, look, let me talk about my case, US v. Georgetown County, okay? I'll tell you the facts, and you decide whether this is such a bad thing. Georgetown County was a 65-35 white-black county, okay? 35% black county. They had seven at-large seats for school board. 7 at-large seats for school board. They had minorities living in concentrated areas in this county. They had racially polarized voting, which you can gauge. You had blacks voting one way, whites voting another. And the racial polarization was resulting in, of those 7 at-large seats, guess how many seats the African Americans would win year after year after year after year after year? None. Right? So Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act steps in and says if you satisfy literally 12 tests, right? You don't just snap your fingers and get this. You have to go through 12 tests, and they're extremely complicated tests. Then you could require district lines to be drawn that elect minorities. Now, they don't look like that, right?
Yeah, and what you're talking about compact groups, so it might make
Yes.
geographical sense to draw districts. What you're talking about is an interpretation of Section 2 to outlaw all at large when,
Oh,
it's
no.
such an effect.
No, I would never take that. You have to satisfy what's called the Jingles preconditions and then the totality of the circumstances test.
Right,
You-
right, but that's an easy case because as I said, I mean, let's not bother with all the technical law, but again, to draw the thing, if you have, a little concentration, if you, let me get rid of this. It's an easy case. If you have a grid, here's your state, and let's say it has, how many does this result in? 4, 8, 12, let's say it has 12 seats in Congress. And racial minorities are concentrated here and here. It's, I think, a perfectly plausible interpretation to, draw your districts like that. The problematic case is if in every one of these districts, there's, 25% minority in every one of these districts, which will obviously result then in 12, the way that the Section 2 has been interpreted will say that minorities don't have their...
Jingles 1.
Right.
That you could not bring a case under the map he just drew because you would not satisfy what's called Jingles 1. Jingles v. Thornburg said that the minorities must live tightly together such that you could draw a district based on however many districts you have. He had 12 in his scenario. You can't do it with that. Now, let me give you guys a heads up.
Going right here, right here.
Well,
There's a river, it's a natural river here.
yeah, well then you get into the Shaw question whether you're only doing that for racial reasons. Now, let me give you guys a look down the future. There's a case I litigated called US v. Lake Park, right? US v. Lake Park is the first case the Justice Department did where we didn't draw districts as a remedy, right? We had 4 seats, town in Florida, Lake Park, Florida. 4 at-large seats, minorities were 40% of the population in that town. They could never elect a minority representative. We satisfied all these tests that I told you about, but instead of drawing districts, we did what's called alternative remedies. We did something called limited voting. So, if you have 4 at-large seats, you only get to vote for 1. You only get, it's called single shot vote. So, you only get to vote for 1 candidate, and it gave the minority voters an opportunity to coalesce around 1 particular candidate without district lines being drawn. So there's other things out there that are in the future involving this problem that we've been talking about. Now, let me tell you what's bad about that remedy, is it creates radicalism. In other words, the loudest, most radical person is probably going to get that 1 single shot vote. And it's why the loudest, most radical elements of the Democrat Party are pushing this idea of limited voting, especially at the Justice Department now, where I used to work. And so there's also things called cumulative voting. You get to stack your votes, right? Everybody gets 4 votes, and you can put 4 of them on the same person. You don't have to draw these districts. So there's ways out there to achieve the goal of minorities being elected without drawing lines that look crazy like that.
I've got a kind of a comment and a question. But, I can't help but have my political science hat on and think about some research I'm familiar with. But
It's a very empirical hat.
it is a very empirical hat. But one issue with gerrymandering that I think is related to some issues of whether you bring lawsuits. But one is the concept of representation is deep and rich, and it's not just racial representation. And so part of the problem with the really funky districts, but they don't even have to get that funky, is that you end up having communities that share certain cultural and economic and social ties, regardless of race. And it makes sense to have a representative who represents those communities together. I mean, I saw a map recently, I think it was in Pennsylvania, of 3 towns that were divided, I think, like three different members of the House of Representatives represented. And so, and I guess to tie it into the law, to what extent does that become relevant, or what extent should it?
The term you're referring to when you're doing your district is called communities of interest.
Okay, right.
And communities of interest can be a defense if you're litigating a Section 2 case as to why lines were drawn a certain way. Or it can pop up in the remedy phase where it comes time for a court to approve a proposed remedy. You can argue to the judge that these represent communities of interest even if it looks funky. And so that's sort of the term you're referring to.
Okay. And it is used because I've seen maps where the argument's made that these communities are being cut up, but you can make that argument in court.
Yeah, and listen, a defendant or an opposing counsel might say, Your Honor, why are they cutting up this community of interest? And he would present evidence of how they're all intertwined, they all go to the same Kiwanis club, and so all of these local factors,
Does it matter a lot? Does it save communities?
No, community of interest issue only comes up is the ways I talked about. Is generally is a very weak defense for a defendant to defend an existing plan. You say, we drew the lines because it was a community of interest. And all this, by the way, is probably coming in through expert testimony often. And then the other side will go, that's no community of interest. There's a railroad track going between, or something like that.
But I can't make my answer. I'm just wondering, you mentioned, there is political science research, right, that political scientists have tried to show a causal relationship between money and voting in Congress, and you can't show it.
Right.
Typically, people give money to people who already share their views, and it doesn't change.
If you want to influence legislation in a way that benefits you, it's much more effective and efficient to lobby.
Yes.
That's what companies do. And there's even more regulations on the lobbying side. It's not like that's a free-for-all. Everyone recognizes that's why every few years there's even further tightening. I mean, there's different rules. We live in DC. We're kind of weird. We go to their fundraisers and PAC events and all these different things. And there's different rules about what you can do if there are sit-down tables versus high boils. The donation limits of like $25 for this, and all of these, very strictly regulated. This is, public disclosure. You can see online. All the lobbyists are registered and how much they spend. I mean, it's all out there, and that indeed is where the influence peddling, to the extent it exists, goes on.
Let me give you guys a dirty little secret about influence peddling. Everyone in this room has more power to peddle influence than, let's say, a $50,000 dark money campaign, okay? I know how much these campaigns waste, right? They'll spend $300,000 the weekend before an election on a get out the vote door knocking exercise that does nothing, right? So you guys can write a letter to the editor that's going to get read in Congress, or an op-ed, or write a letter to your congressman on real paper with a stamp and mail it, and you will have more effectiveness exercising your First Amendment rights than the waste that goes on spending dark money. I mean, you guys have the power already.
I just need a clarification. What's dark money?
Oh, do you want to take that one? So, dark money is good.
I was asking. It's not even a legal term of art. It's kind of a political epithet to describe political spending that you don't necessarily get to the bottom of all my disclosure chain to find out who's spending it.
And I use it as a joke term because this is what campaign speech regulators call it, is this evil dark money, like Darth Vader, right? And so I'm trying to tell you, you guys have more power than dark money. You can do things in a campaign that dwarfs the effectiveness of dark money, because here's the dirty secret. The people who spend the dark money, the consultants, waste it and spend it inefficiently. And if you guys do basic things, you're going to outpace the effectiveness of dark money in your own lives. And so dark money is overrated as something that's effective.
So you're speaking about radicalization and how people in these districts have to radicalize in order to become elected. I guess I was just kind of wondering why that is so much worse than people having to meet in the middle and compromise once they've been elected to office.
It's a great question. That's a really good question. You've challenged my premise. I read too much history, and I know what happens in countries when polarization takes hold. When people of completely different worldviews have to live together and don't have any respect for their opponents. And bad things usually happen, especially when the power of the state's involved. When one gets a hold of the power of the state and the other is on the outside looking in, and then they flip places every now and then. It's never a pretty picture. So I think radicalization and polarization is far more dangerous. It's a story of history. You know, the English Civil War is a great example between the monarchy and Cromwell. I mean, we could spend 20 minutes on different examples in history.
But Christian, is there really more polarization in the American polity, right? So let's say you have a distribution of political views with bell curve. There we go. Let's say that's the distribution of American political views. How much does that change? Maybe you shift a little left, a little right, I don't know. Maybe it's flattened a little, sharpened a little, I don't know, over the last 30 years or whatever time period you want to say. Congress, I think it's quite clear, has gotten more polarized because of gerrymandering and campaign finance and all the rest of it.
I don't think your bell curve is accurate. I think you'd like to think it is, but I don't think it's accurate.
I'm stylizing the example.
Okay.
I mean, it could be flatter. I mean, whatever. Well, no. I mean, let me say my point. Right. The average Dem and the average R.
Yeah.
And this
This is a classic libertarian fallacy that you just put up there. And libertarians always labor under the false assumption that there's a disconnect between the political class and the regular class. And they talk about how, and you cited this a couple times today when you talked about incumbency and how bad incumbency is. I disagree with that. I think the House of Representatives, the way the founders set it up, in fact represents, in large measure, the body politic. And I think that the House of Representatives was very different 40 years ago than it is today.
But wouldn't it, without the radicalization dynamic that you described very well, without that, wouldn't you have more moderates of both parties?
Yeah, you would. And is that such a good thing? Which goes back to this question, to have more moderates of both parties. Here's the difference. Here's why I believe in liberty, right? And I know that the radicals on the left are more effective at their radicalism than the radicals on the right. And I know that given the war of radicals, that my side of radicals are going to lose because they don't know how to fight, right? I know the left knows how to fight better. And so I don't like the radicalism because it means I'm probably going to lose. They're better organized.
But if you get rid of the campaign finance regime, maybe you'd have lots of third parties come up. Gene McCarthy couldn't exist under the anti-war challenge to Lyndon Johnson.
There weren't effective third parties before the campaign finance regime, so that doesn't work.
Well, but if you could have, in periods where there's discontent with the oligopoly, Ross Perot, rather than running himself as this kooky, weird, bad candidate, could have spent that money on a good candidate with similar types or better, views, or Steve Forbes for that matter.
Well, one of the other, and by the way, libertarianism is in my DNA. Okay, so when I bash libertarianism, I'm bashing myself.
I'm a classical liberal myself.
Okay, I am too.
Perhaps an old
But
way.
one of the other fallacies of libertarianism is it discounts the role of culture. It doesn't think culture has this mystic chord of memory that blasts through time and changes how people view things. And how does that affect this issue? Well, people in this country are used to a two-party system. It's part of our culture. And you're not going to change that culture by getting rid of campaign finance regulations most people don't even know about, right? Most people in America don't even know these things exist. And so you think removing them is going to say, I'm looking for a new third party. It's not going to do it. It's just not going to do it. And I'm a classical, you can be a libertarian and classical liberal.
Okay.
Does anybody have any other questions?
By the way, the last time we had a viable third party or the rise of a new party was right before when we started to fray to pieces and have a bloodbath. And so I'm not always such a fan on radical
You
transformations.
mean George Wallace?
No, I'm talking about 1856. And so I'm not such a fan of wholesale replacement of stable institutions.
But I mean, at the margins, in certain congressional districts, or I don't know. I say, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Let's, let the socialists and the libertarians and the Greens and whoever else wants to run. And regional parties for that matter.
How does the campaign finance regime that I dislike and you dislike harm libertarians or the Green Party? Where they're subject to
Big
the same-
libertarians, because of the tapering of the supply of donations. You can't have a big donor write a big check and
You could have a Citizens United Independent Expenditure campaign from a big L libertarian donor. You could have a $4 billion libertarian Elon Musk funding the next LP candidate, just like Sheldon Adelson does for Newt Gingrich. There are no institutional impediments to libertarians or the Greens that don't also exist for Republicans. They don't have their unique laws, right? Now, you can argue, well, these laws affect them marginally worse than they do the parties, but that's just a failure.
Because of culture and kind of inertia and indeed incumbency protection. The parties are incumbents; they make deals together to preserve their oligopoly. I think at the margins, I'm not saying there would be a huge sweeping change, or that instantly you would have a plethora of parties, or but I think you would have more responsiveness. You could have a Tea Party emerge by itself. You could have I don't know, or they would put more pressure on the existing parties as the Tea Party has done without 40%.
I'll make a bold, completely unsupported hypothesis. If we were to return to pre-McCutcheon and pre-Citizens United and only impose those campaign finance rules on the Democrats and the Republicans, right? This tight regime where you can't do anything. Yet, we were to carve out an exemption for the Libertarian Party and the Greens where there's absolutely no regulations. None. I guarantee you the LP and the Greens would still fail. Yes, Lons?
Depends on your definition of failure. But
They wouldn't win any seats.
I think you two are missing the biggest problem that actually third parties
But,
have.
by the way, let me pause it. Hans Mostakowski used to serve on the Federal Election Commission. So one of 6 members appointed by the president to serve on the FEC.
The biggest problem for third parties in the country, I think, is the fact that the rules governing becoming qualified to put your candidates on the ballot are extremely restrictive in many states, and it is very difficult for third parties to do that.
Yeah, we didn't talk about that. The ballot access law, see, now I was going to mention that because that might change things. But one's, which comes first, the signatures or the egg? So. Now, you guys can come tomorrow and see us totally agree on everything. So I hope you enjoyed the show.
I tweet at iShapiro. My email is ishapiro@cato.org. You're what? At
Election Law CTR. I picked that name before I realized the importance of a short Twitter handle. So.
And we tweet at NIU FedSoc, and we follow them and tweet all the time, so follow us and follow them too.
What panel are you guys on tomorrow?
We're on different ones. I'm on
Yeah.
one that's like 9:30 or 10 o'clock or something.
We're the token, we're the,
I'm on why Shelby was right and amending the Voting Rights Act is wrong, and you're on, what are you on?
state voting laws,
Okay.
so.
And they're gonna be at Scotch and Cigar Night after the law review.